I'm talking about Karl Jaspers' notion of a boundary situation, Grenzsituation in German, and the experience of death and personal growth. As I told you earlier, the topic I was thinking about in this year, in this group is the experience of death, the first person experience of death, so-called near-death experience, is that a source of personality growth? Karl Jaspers was a German-Swiss psychiatrist and philosopher who had a very strong influence, and he's practically a forefather of what we are doing here. His psychopathology, psychopathology, was very influential in the early 20th century, but later on in his life, from practice in psychiatry, he turned into philosophical inquiry and developed an innovative philosophical system, which is by many considered to be the most important German contribution to existentialism in the 20th century. And that's him. So he introduced the technical term boundary situation, or in German Grenzsituation. And the boundary is an existential experience, a breakthrough situation. It is through this experience that humans transcend the limitations of everyday life and enter into the realm of true existence as self-determined individual. So the process of personality growth to become, in Rogerian terms, a true person is always bound to a boundary situation. So one of the boundary situations is tragedy and loss. So one of my favorite philosophers, if not the favorite philosopher after Leibniz, is Alfred North Whitehead. And Alfred North Whitehead gave a classic definition of youth. He said, youth is life yet untouched by tragedy. So some people lose their youth very early, if that's the correct definition. And that's exactly what Jaspers has in mind. Personality growth is facilitated by the encounter of Grenzsituation. And that's what he calls existence. So human Dasein, human existence, small e, is not yet existence. Existence as the fully mature person is only to be found by facing a boundary situation. Classical examples is death, despair, Verzweiflung, that's a very Kierkegaardian thought, and also what he calls Scheitern, failure. So it's through those that you fully mature, become a mature person, your personality grows. So in those experiences you awaken to existence, which is more than mere existence. Existence is a certain a certain awareness that you do not necessarily have before you enter the Grenzsituation. And existence in that sense, existence, it's hard to translate in English, is for him one and the same. And it's necessarily antinomical. There is no solution. Despair, death is final. Despair cannot fully be overcome, and failure also is failure. There's no way to sugarcoat it. So in the boundary situation, the continuity of the previous life is interrupted. The insecurity of existence has to be endured. And I look now more specifically at one of the boundary situations, namely death. Death as my own becomes a borderline situation or boundary situation. In death, I'm irreplaceable. That's really my existence. Similar in despair, there is an element of despair even even though despair Verzweiflung is not just related to death. In the process of dying, you feel powerlessness, decay, loss of control. And death itself is the impossibility of all possibilities and the fear of absolute abandonment. Dying as extreme loneliness. It's the case where I'm abandoned by everyone and cannot be replaced. It's an irreplaceable task. And what causes the despair? It's the fear of nothingness, of total obliteration, of the destruction of myself. Also, the loss of a shared future. I share a future with you, hopefully for many more years, but death takes away the shared future. The world goes on, but I do not partake in it anymore. Also, if in the end I die, what is the meaning of all my endeavors? They seem to become meaningless. 2 generations after my death, usually nobody even remembers me. That's true for most people. You're completely obliterated. So what has my life seems meaningless if that's my future, to end in complete nothingness in terms of human community. Also, the unlived life, the life what could have been, what I have missed is now final. When I'm alive, I could still make a turn and live out something, growth, which I have not yet realized, but death puts an end to this. The end of all possibilities. So the fear of death is the fear of all these missed opportunities. But death also opens up new possibilities. That's typical for each boundary situation, that it also has a dimension of transcendence, he calls it. So I could, for example, ask myself the question, I want to be in control. Instead of undergo the process of dying, I could, in autonomy, take my life, which Camus said that's the ultimate, maybe the only philosophical question is, why don't I commit suicide? And so that question is, without death, not even possible. There might be something like a leap of faith, how I face death. So I just give up my autonomy, the opposite, and completely give myself to something which produced me. And if it weren't for the disappearance, I would be endless in duration. And he says, if I would be endless in duration, I would not even exist. That's a thought that's later on was taken up by other philosophers. Like, if my life was really endless, as a philosopher, I have maybe let's now published 10 books, maybe before I die 20 books, whatever. But if my life is endless, even after I've published 10 million books, that's not even the first second of infinity. So life as existence doesn't make sense if life is endless. Only what is of value in the faith of death is worth living, And ultimately this sums up, we need a kind of tragic heroism in the faith of death, bravery in the faith of death, and death must not be diffused religiously as a mere transition. Otherwise, there would not be despair, and it would not lead us to existence. So the religious hope for him destroys the growth potential in death. Other possibilities of new possibilities he mentions are the conveyance of an experience of being giving to oneself, experiencing of being carried without reason, a belief that has abandoned all knowledge, a hovering over the abyss. He calls it to be in der Schwebe bleiben, hovering over the abyss. There's no solution like a religious belief. So in the face of death, human existence means to hover over the abyss, über dem Abgrund schweben. Returning to the present in the face of death, the present is experienced more intensely. So people who have experienced death experience the present more intensely. And then the preciousness of the present it is good this way, even if it has an end. It's not devalued just because it is finite. You see, this is a very negative view of death. Death is tragedy. Death is absurd. Death is the end of all relationship. It's the end of consciousness. And only in this negativity is death a motor for personality growth. If we kind of soften the negativity, we become not well adjusted to reality. It seems to be a very Freudian thought that the mature person has to face the absurdity of existence. And it's a kind of childish, religion is a childish attitude because we cannot bear the tragedy of human existence. Now, many years ago, I had a very profound near-death experience, and so I studied near-death experiences empirically and philosophically and theologically, and I've published a few things about this. The most recent one in a very nice book edited by Georg Gasser. So I will not talk much about the interpretation of near-death experiences and all the different models, whether we can explain them or not. It's not important here. I will ask the question, what we know about dying, is this consistent with Jaspers' view? So people who are on the brink of death due to a medical emergency report intense experience that lie outside the normal states of consciousness. The frequency of such experiences can only be roughly estimated. We now believe it's about 20% of patients who had undergone cardiac arrest, at least 20% of those can remember having had a near-death experience. And due to advances in intensive care medicine, millions of people who have survived resuscitation and had these profound experiences are alive today in our technologically or medically advanced societies. Recently, guidelines for the scientific treatment of NDEs were published in the Annals of the New York Academy of Sciences in 2022. And they proposed, because the term near-death experience is ideologically charged, due to disputes over interpretation, the authors proposed the term recalled experience of death, RED. So an RED is defined by the following 6 criteria: a relationship to death, a sense of transcendence, an ineffability of the experience, so it cannot be expressed in language, a positive transformative impact, personality growth, that's what interests me here, in terms of meaning and purpose of life, a severity of illness leading to loss of consciousness, and the absence of features of other coma-like experiences like conventional dreams, delirium, delusions in the ICU, or LSD experiences. The authors of that study, it's the book I can recommend last year, Lucid Dying, by a professor at NYU Medical School in New York University by the name of Sam Pania. And it's a lot of very interesting findings in this book. It's really mind-boggling. So, like he starts off with that they actually achieved resuscitating the brains of decapitated pigs 8 hours after the pigs were decapitated. And the brains were not even refrigerated in a special way or kept in a special state. But even after 8 hours, the nerve cells could be reactivated without oxygen and without blood flow. This flies in the face of everything we know. This is really a revolution in our understanding of death. So it's what he describes in this book. So what the typical elements are an awareness of being dead, a sense of peace and great mental calm and clarity, a sense of liberation and weightlessness, out-of-body experiences such as perceiving one's own body from the outside, a bird's eye view, a detailed life review that illuminates one's existence, especially with respect of where have I loved, where have I hurt, experiences oneself from the perspective of other people, so this transpersonal view, insight into the consequences of one's action at an ethical level, an experience of being immersed in a tunnel, a sense of transition, a sense of leaving one's body behind, the feeling of detachment from events in the world, a rapid movement towards a strong light, the feeling of being spiritually attracted, the feeling of entering another reality and being at home in a spiritual sense, the experience of help and support, spiritual communication with beings of light. Finally, gaining deeper insight into the meaning of human existence, broadening of spiritual horizons, the feeling of immersion in unconditional love, approaching a boundary, and reluctance to return into the biological body and the associated pain. Now, what I will focus on in this very brief presentation is the well-studied effects of NDEs. The most striking is that practically all experiencers who have an RAD or NDE lose all fear of death. I can certainly say that's true in my case. Sometimes when I fall asleep, I begin to fall asleep, and sleep is the little brother of death. The process of falling asleep reminds me that I will someday die. And that immediately puts a smile on my face and say, oh great, yeah, I will someday die. And I never had this before the near-death experiences. Before the near-death experiences, I had the Jasperian view, so to speak. Also, there is almost always a permanent change in the ordering of values. Love, deep personal relationships, and the acquisition of wisdom are at the center of life. Money, career, power, recognition, sensual satisfaction, pleasure, but also superficial pastimes and the consumption of material goods become less attractive. In a famous large-scale study, Dutch cardiologist Pim van Lommel classified these changes in character and attitude and showed that near-death survivors with REDS differed from comparison groups who had also experienced an existentially threatening cardiological emergency but had no recollection of an NDE. So that was a very influential study published in the journal Lancet, and he followed those people for 8 years after the experience, and it turned out that the personality change is very drastic, and it doesn't become less and less over time, but it increases over time. And they had a control group of people who just had a cardiac arrest and were resuscitated and had no near-death experience, and there were no similar changes, at least not to a much lower degree. And they also disappeared more easily after time. So it's not only striking that those who have an NDE often completely and permanently lose the fear of death, whereas this cannot be observed in the control groups who also had a cardiac arrest and were resuscitated. Other changes are an altered self-image, more compassion for others, a stronger intuitive sensitivity in the interpersonal area, and increased spirituality. In Van Lommel's landmark study, patients were interviewed 3 times in 8 years with a matched control group. It could be shown that patients with REDs experienced profound changes in their outlook on life, their value system, their attitude towards death, their spirituality, and their religious views that not only persisted over many years, but were actually increasing in intensity. And there was a more recent study by Grayson, published in 2022. He followed survivors of cardiac arrest with near-death experiences at a control group over 20 years and used the so-called LFI, Life Change Index, to document how substantial their life changes or their outlook on life was. The subjects reported increases in their appreciation of death, in the quest for meaning and purpose in life, more self-acceptance, religiosity, concern for others, and increased concern for social and planetary issues, while at the same time experiencing a sharp drop in their concern for worldly achievement. These changes were persistent over an average of 20.5 years. So experiences of NDEs or REDs have undergone significant personality change. Is this personality growth? Of course, that's arguably they have undergone personality growth, because in our standard value system to become more deeply caring, more deeply loving, more sympathetic, less material, more seeking wisdom and instead of riches, is personality growth. Of course, you can question this, but I just take it for granted for the time being. So, and they self-classify this as the moment in which they grew more than at any other time in their life. And they certainly fulfill the Rogerian criteria for becoming a person, which I presented at the beginning of this conference. So in Jasperian terms, these experiences have moved from merely living in a superficial way, what Heidegger would call the Verfallenheit an das Mann. I don't even know how to say that in English, to existence. But look at how different their outlook is from how Jaspers describes death. there the NDE does not seem to fulfill the criteria of a boundary situation. There's no failing, there's no scheitern, there's no despair. The process of dying as experienced in an RAD is not powerlessness, it's not decay, it's not loss of control, it's quite the opposite. Death itself is not the impossibility of possibilities and the fear of abandonment, but exactly the opposite. New possibilities open up to an extent that seemed to be completely impossible in my normal waking consciousness. And certainly dying is not extreme loneliness. It's extremely social and interpersonally interconnected from the first person point of view. So I'm not talking about interpretations. I think all of this would be true if all of this is just an illusion, because I'm interested in the phenomenology, how it feels like. So I'm not talking about the interpretation. I'm gladly talk about the interpretation but it's a whole different topic and would take a different presentation. So the experience of death is not nothingness, not obliteration, not the destruction of the self. It's an awakening of the self. Experience of death is not destruction of meaning, it's the discovery of meaning. It does not introduce fear, it takes away fear. So for Jaspers, a tragic heroism is necessary in the faith of death, bravery in the faith of death. Death must not be diffused religiously as a mere transition. Otherwise there would be no despair, and then there would be no chance for real existence. Without despair, no existence. Existence in his sense. But the NDE is the overcoming of despair, and from the view of the experiencer, leads to radical existence. So it's a completely different outlook. It seems, or maybe not. So there seems to be a puzzle here. Only one of the two pictures can be right. For Jaspers, only the acceptance of the tragedy of mortal existence leads to true existence, personality growth. Only the acceptance of the absurdity and meaninglessness of death enables us to live as existence, as fully human, as fully grown as adults. This is the very essence of full human existence. For the experience of an NDE, personality growth is achieved by the experience that death is not absurd and not to be feared. So how can that be reconciled? Can it be easily reconciled? That's a puzzle I'm thinking about, and I'm interested in your input. Thank you very much.
Would it be fair to say that Jaspers is developing his concept of death and its implications in the sense that he's talking about the proximity of death, living in the proximity of death, but that he does not have or was not able to speak with insight into the moment of death. I'm trying to find a way of understanding the difference in the description of the radical, deep difference, chasm even between what you described as this positive change induced and the deeply negative image of the situation of despair. What also comes to mind what came to my mind as you were talking was the question of what the ars moriendi is or could be in this context. Because speaking from a religious tradition, the idea of addressing the fear that is common, addressing the fear of death and facing the diminished abilities, especially in old age or associated with illness, in a religious sense would work towards developing a positive outlook and a cherishing of relations more than personal ability, and this that the effects or the positive elements that you described are conceivable even now, but seem to be realized perhaps in a more intensive way after the state of consciousness.
Yeah, of course I thought about this myself, but it's somehow, I think, misinterpreting or not truthfully interpreting Jaspers as I read him, because he said if you somehow take on the religious hope that death is just a transition, you destroy the possibility of entering existence. Existence requires to accept the acceptance of that death is an absurdity. So it's not as easily reconciled. So you say, well, that's like he's looking at it from the outside. He's just approaching death, and that's how it looks from the outside. But if you actually experience death, RED, a recollected experience of death, only most people have never experienced death, it looks different. But it's not that easy, because he says that if that's the truth about death, what the NDA people experience, then it's no longer a Grenz situation.
Yeah. But is it accurate to say that that people who have faith even in the religious convictions, faith even in the face of death, that they are not appreciating the gravity of death? I'm not convinced that those are that those are not compatible. But I imagine, I have a hunch that it's also possible to appreciate the severity and absurdity, even or incomprehensibility of death, and yet cling to hope in the face of death. Perhaps that's a romantic, or that's maybe I'm naive or religiously. I don't know.
I think Matthias is very eager to say something.
No, I agree. I would argue, first of all, the notion, the definition of death as the impossibility of all possibilities. I think the first mention of that was Sartre. That was Sartre against Heidegger, and Levinas took it perhaps from Sartre, but it's a Sartre topos. The problem in your talk for me, and what I understood is the same. I agree with you. The problem is the identification of a near-death experience with the notion of death itself, and that seems me to be problematic.
Oh, and just a second. The notion of death, the Pyrians who have experienced death have. So it's a notion, yeah, but based on an experience. But continue.
And that leads to a in German I would call it Thanatodice. And against that Thanatodice, I would argue in the name of the death of the beloved one. That's my main point. Yeah, that's my main point. And so I would argue with Paulus, death, where is your stick? Yes. And ich würde mich verweigern.
Say it in German and it's fine.
Ich würde mich verweigern einer Gerechtsprechung des Todes, ja, im Namen des geliebten anderen. Und ich glaube, dass der Tod, also was man vom Tod lernen kann, ist, dass er sich einer Systematisierung sperrt. Also das ist die fundamentale These, die ich in dieser thanatologischen Debatte habe, dass der Tod eben die Grenze des Lebens und des Denkens ist. Und dass dein Vortrag sozusagen genau auf diese Grenze hingeführt hat. Er ist nicht systematisierbar, er ist nicht synthetisierbar, ja, sondern er führt uns eben an die Bruchstellen. Und die einzige Antwort, die ich sozusagen habe, und so habe ich dich verstanden, ist zu unterscheiden zwischen dem Sterben, das ich lernen muss im Zuge des Erwachsenwerdens, an dem ich wachsen kann, und vielleicht ist die äußerste Weise dann diese Nahtoderfahrung. Ja. Und vielleicht ist das tatsächlich das, was man religiös Gnade nennt. Aber das würde ich strikt unterscheiden vom Tod, an dessen Negativität ich festhalten würde, und zwar im Namen des Gottes des Lebens.
We are in Germany, why not an occasional sentence in German? So, but yeah, we can continue to talk about this. I agree mostly. I think Jaspers' concept could be saved if he talks about die Grenzsituation as always containing an element of transcendence. And when he talks about Scheitern, he develops this more fully, but his view of death is completely negative. If he would somehow have that tension that you describe, that could be an element of a real Grenzsituation. And he dissolves this into one direction, into a very negative view of death. So I see that there's a potential for maybe not, he even calls it antinomical, as I said. So there is maybe not a potential for a solution of this tension, but for more coherence or something like that. Yeah. Yes.
I don't know if I'm knowledgeable enough to discuss these things. It's a very philosophical thing, and I don't know what Sartre said, and so on and so on. But I see two things here. One is in the last statement, death is not absurd and is not be feared. It sounds like an if-then clause, kind of. But one thing, absurdity is a concept that we make up by cognition, and fear is an emotion which is already evolutionarily implemented in us. So every animal doesn't want to die, first of all, or at least when there is the point that the costs and the benefits are equal, and we think, okay, let's die, maybe it's even better. We still may have ambivalent feelings, typically, maybe not you, Godehard, I don't know. So just saying that we can still be ambivalent, although I think, oh, it's meaningful to die, still fear the current, now it's going on, okay. And the other thing is the existentialist idea that life is absurd, or death, because we will all die. I think it's kind of a narcissistic stance. It's not absurd when we give up our lives in order for other people to live, for my children to live, yeah? Because when we live forever, there's no need for children, because there are enough people on the world. So I think it has much to do with transcendence, with self-transcendence, and this is what you mentioned, I guess, for the love of others, to be able to give in and to die. So, yeah.
I think that's very valuable, and I agree.